we are now looking at probably at the worst possible scenario, which is if you're not getting killed in bombardment, you will be, you have a real risk of death, of starvation, disease, or thirst, really.
There is a feeling of almost a miracle having been produced this morning when these two hostages were rescued in really a remarkable military operation. And it's the first time Israelis have seen any hostages brought out alive since November. So it's very moving, and it's significant. But 134 remain behind. And regarding this Rafah offensive, I have to tell you that my impression is that Netanyahu, who is speaking very aggressively about a Rafah operation, a very specific military offensive, at this point daily, has succeeded in getting the hackles of the entire world up and really concerning Israelis who don't know what the future of this offensive is and whose children are dying every single day. Israel got news today of the two freed hostages and at the same time got news of a further two Israeli soldiers killed and many wounded. So all of this is happening at the same time. Meanwhile, the offensive is not underway. No one seems to know what it is. And as you say, it doesn't actually seem to be feasible without a mass humanitarian disaster. So there are a lot of questions, including the very unpleasant question I think we have to ask, which is to what an extent is the Israeli Prime Minister repeating very belligerent talk about a Rafah offensive because he believes this will please his base, his political base, while the military possibility for such an offensive is not even clear at all.
Mm. And is it pleasing his base? And how big is his base? Because we're told quite often that he's particularly, his lack of popularity is escalating rather than the opposite.
That's exactly right. So he believes that it will please his base. That's clear. And maybe his base has shrunk now to his most extremist parliamentarians and ministers who he has to keep on side in order to remain in power, while every single poll, including three polls released this weekend, show not only that his policies are very unpopular, but that 80% of Israelis want to see him gone. So no, it's not working among the greater public. It does seem to be working to a pretty significant extent among his ministers and among his parliamentarians, because despite the catastrophe visited upon Israel since October 7th, I think that we also need to mention this week Moody's, for the first time in Israel's history, Moody's downgraded Israel's credit rating, and it was very clear that it's doing so not just because of the war, but principally because of government mismanagement. So Netanyahu's government has brought untold disaster to Israelis, and he's trying somehow to muddle his way through.
Just finally, because it is rare for us to get good news from the region at the moment, tell me a little bit about the hostages. Do we know how they were located, how they were rescued? What do we know about them? I think that they're brothers-in-law, surprisingly.
Yes, they're brothers-in-law who were spending with their wider family. They were spending a holiday weekend together on this beautiful southern kibbutz on October 7th when they were kidnapped. Their spouses, their two wives, were also kidnapped, but were released in the November general hostage release.
Mm.
Um, we know that it was, all I've been able to find out is that it was an extremely complex operation, that the army had very precise intel about where they were, that it was conducted under such silence that the two men had to be awakened at around 4 a.m. by soldiers who managed to get to them. They lost more than half their body weight, but they seem to be otherwise in good health. And you're right, it has been, I think, the only source of a feeling of possible good news for Israelis, I don't know, in the last many months at this point.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time out to tell us about it. Thank you, Noga Tarnopolsky in Jerusalem. Thank you for talking to Times Radio. Let's now turn to Ahmed Bayram, a spokesperson for the Norwegian Refugee Council, which provides civilian relief in Gaza. I'm sure, Ahmed, you heard part of what Noga was saying there. But can you explain, what's happened in Rafah since the conflict began? I mean, how many Gazans have fled there, what the conditions are? Because as we understand it, there's something like 1.5 million people there in a sort of last stand, as it were, with nowhere else to go.
That's correct. Thanks for having me. Rafah has been the last resort in terms of options for civilians to go to, either to get aid or to get any sense of safety, if that is such a thing in Gaza anymore. People have been pushed all the way from north and then ended up in Rafah. Rafah, just to put it into perspective, is probably 63 kilometers, square kilometers in size, and now is hosting 1.4 to 1.5 million people. And that is, to put that into perspective, it's 1/10 the size of a city like Oslo with double the population. Now, people are there to get aid. There's a real risk of a nightmare scenario of people being cut off from this aid, and us aid workers being cut off from the Rafah crossing, which has provided a lifeline for these people. So yes,
Mm.
probably, after 130 days or something, we are now looking at probably at the worst possible scenario, which is if you're not getting killed in bombardment, you will be, you have a real risk of death, of starvation, disease, or thirst, really.
I wanted to ask you, what are the conditions that people in Rafah are already living in at the moment without this proposed offensive?
Yeah, so we work around 9 to 12 shelters in Rafah. These shelters are schools, public facilities. They are full at 150% of capacity. At some of these shelters, there are hundreds of people who don't have a corner to stay to occupy in these shelters, and so they have to stay outdoors. There's a spread of disease, hepatitis A, there's diarrhea, there's all sorts of stomach pain and contagious diseases. People don't have drinking water, fresh water in the majority of these shelters. They don't have enough food. One of my colleagues was telling me that he spent 1 week looking for 3 eggs for his children, 1 kilogram of beef, which is, of course, beyond reach, out of reach for these people, is probably $50 now. Costs for
My goodness.
$50.
Mm.
So it's a nightmare that is unfolding in Rafah. We need a ceasefire. We need release of all the hostages, and we need the two warring sides to come to an agreement to spare more civilian deaths.
Just finally, I mean, the flow of aid into Gaza, particularly since the UNRWA offices were closed, um, is there aid getting to these people?
Very little, very little. I mean, a few dozens of trucks every day. The Rafah crossing, which I mentioned, with Egypt, is bringing in some aid. It's nowhere near enough. People have to, fend for themselves. I'm sure you've heard of people baking bread out of animal feed, of children drinking from ponds of water, anything that you can come across, people eating all sorts of things. We are looking at a real disaster here, because even the day after, if you think of that, and that can't come soon enough, we will be looking at a real catastrophe. We need hundreds and hundreds and thousands of aid trucks, and there are hundreds of trucks that are lined up across the border from Rafah. They're not getting in the numbers required. And again, the call here is not to start another front in Rafah, but to come to this agreement, stop the hostilities from both sides, release all the hostages, and of
Mm.
course allow aid into this, catastrophic death zone, really.
I think your colleague has said that the consequences of a ground offensive would be a bloodbath, Jan Egeland,
Yeah.
who's Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council. Do you agree?
Absolutely. I mean, I mean, it has been a bloodbath all this time. 30,000 almost people have been killed, thousands more injured. There are babies. I've seen videos of babies. I've seen news of babies who were born and killed in this, in the span of 130 days. I'm a father, and I know, the, the reality, that when you face a risk of this size, I have been to explosions. I have been to areas of conflict zones. And the thing you think about the most is your children, how they're going to spend the night. And one of my colleagues has given his child, some yogurt for the first time in 3 months, I think. And you could see the smile on that kid's face. He almost forgot how that tasted. These children don't deserve it. They don't deserve what they are going through. And this is why, again, we renew our calls for a ceasefire.